I'm absolutely delighted that Joe Stiglitz is here. He's connecting from the beach in the US, and very kind of him to take time out of his very precious holiday to participate in this event. So Joe, thank you so much for joining us. I don't know anyone in the world who I admire more than Joe in terms of not only his academic abilities, his really brilliant and beautiful mind, but also his engagement in policy in the real world, combining what is really, and has got the deservedly so, the Nobel Prize, the John Bates Clark Genius Award in the US early in his career, with path-breaking academic work and an ability to engage in public life with governments, with institutions like the World Bank, where he was chief economist, with the US government, where he was chairman of the National Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton, and with over 50 governments around the world. He's someone who always finds time too for students, for engaging in debate. And in addition to being an absolutely prolific writer, I counted 33 books when I went through his 138-page CV on his website today. He is constantly thinking about new issues. He's an academic who was always ahead of his time, from his early writing in the 60s to today, where he's thinking about the future of technology. And we'll come on to some of those conversations that cover the breadth and span of his more recent work. But let's begin, Joe, by talking about the thing that concerns us both. I'm, for those of you that don't know me, the Professor of Globalisation and Development at Oxford University. I'm the director of the Oxford Martin School's projects on the future of technological and economic change, and have in previous lives been head of policy at the World Bank Group and done a few other things where I was fortunate to intersect with Joe in his many, many different roles. COVID-19 has distracted us all from work we were previously doing, and has to be our preoccupation at the moment. And so, Joe, I'd be very keen to know whether you see any silver lining. It's been a depressing time, a very worrying time for all of us. But at the same time, some of the areas where we thought economic orthodoxy would never move, like in discussions of deficits and like in discussions of basic wages, like in the role of government in supporting the private sector, and in thinking in new ways about the role of government in the private sector, there's been accelerated change. Has the pendulum swung dramatically from the Thatcher-Reagan era into a new era? Are we back into a period of perhaps more Keynesian thought? Do you find that the ideas that you've been arguing for over so many years are finally now at the forefront of policymakers' minds in governments and in other areas?
So what I was saying is there's both a positive and a negative aspect of this. At the moment in March, there was a very strong response, the largest fiscal response ever. But on the other hand, at least in the United States, there's a reluctance to continue that support on the part of the Republicans. And there's a refusal to support some parts of the economy where the need is very strong, state and local governments, educational institutions. There is a reversion back to deficits matter, even though in December 2017, you had a multi-trillion-dollar tax cut for the very rich and the corporations. So I think I would say that the issues are still being contested in the United States. What we did see, I think most citizens realized that 40 years of denigration of the role of government has resulted in a government that was ill prepared for responding to the crisis. And I think within citizens, there's a recognition that only the government could help us address, each of us individually can't develop the tests that we need, can't manage the pandemic. So there is a moment of realization, I think, of most citizens that government has a absolutely central role. There's an interesting aspect of this that Michael Lewis was a very wonderful, popular writer, wrote a book called The Fifth Risk. And he put his finger on one aspect of what the Trump administration was doing in the United States and neoliberal governments have done around the world, that they had undermined the ability of the governments to respond to risk. And he couldn't have been more prescient in identifying this as one of the key failings. And that, he didn't talk about a pandemic. He talked about all kinds of climate change, climate risk and all kinds of other risks. But we now see that we were ill prepared for this particular risk.
And do you worry that this awareness is going to perhaps not be sustained? Is there a risk that we've made some precarious gains in the way that people understand government, but that come the elections in the US in November and elections across Europe and elsewhere, we're going to see a reversion to where we were? Or do you see this as a shift which is permanent?
Oh, I do think it's a shift. I think in some countries, like the United States, there are many of these issues that are under contest. So, for instance, there are many individuals who don't recognize the nature of the externality of public health, that they put primacy on their ability to do whatever they wish, but don't take into account the fact that if they go around without a mask, or they can spread the disease, and they put at risk the lives of other people. So this is an idea that I talked about. One person's freedom is another person's unfreedom. My right to carry a gun and shoot is another person, deprives another person his right to live. My right to pollute is your right. It deprives you of the right to live. And in a complex society, we have to somehow balance these rights. And I think among the vast majority of our citizens, there's a consensus. You don't have the right to kill other people. And that's been true since the Ten Commandments. So I think the critical issue here is that in a complex society, these kinds of externalities, these kinds of restrictions that we all accept in order to make a better functioning society are broader, and we have to accept them.
At the same time, we've seen in the US, but also in some European and other societies, in Brazil, a very worrying rise in nationalism and protectionism and more individualism. So do you see that there's some sort of combination of two different strands that are going to have to contest this, and that it's a time for those that believe in social solidarity to make their voices heard louder and clearer?
Yes, I think that in globalization, there are these two tensions going on. We have created global supply chains that were not resilient. We've become more aware of the extent of our dependence on others, and maybe in some cases the unreliability of that. But at the same time, we've recognized that we are interdependent, and we necessarily will be. There's no way we can stop that. The viruses don't carry passports, visas, climate change, those carbon dioxide molecules go from one country to another. So I think this is a moment where we really need to recognize the importance of global cooperation. But we also have to restructure globalization in ways that will make our global supply chains, for instance, more resilient.
I recall a debate that I chaired between you and Ken Rogoff many years ago when he was chief economist, I think, at the IMF, and he was advocating that there were limits to how much debt governments could take on, and if they went over those limits, the countries would inevitably get into a crisis, and you contested that very strongly. Do you think you've been vindicated by what we've seen in recent years, and particularly after COVID-19?
Well, very much so. But first, I should point out that about 5-8 years ago, there was a whole rash of research which showed that the Rogoff research was not based on good data. It was not based on the basic good analytics where, there have been statistical econometric techniques that are used in a standard way to test hypotheses like the one that if debt goes above a certain level, there are severe consequences. The research was rejected. But I think this moment of time where the deficits are rising to levels that have never before been seen. I mean, I think the U.S. is on line to have somewhere between 15 and 18, 19% of GDP deficit. In 1 year, our deficit, a debt to GDP ratio will rise to over 100% by September. And yet, we're not facing problems of inflation. The government is the only one who can undertake these levels of debt and sustain our economic system. And the other analogy I give was when we went to war in World War II. We didn't ask could we afford it. We undertook debt. Nobody was saying, "Oh, if you undertake this debt, it's going to be disastrous. Let's just surrender now." Nobody said that. And I said before the climate change, we were fighting a war to preserve our planet, and we had to do whatever it takes. To use the words of Mario Draghi. Well, this is the moment where almost universally everybody said we're fighting a war against this COVID-19, this virus, and we have to do whatever it takes. And we will win, but we have to use what resources we can and figure out afterwards the finance.
So you referred to the Second World War, which is an interesting analogy for me, because the Second World War, while the bombs were literally dropping on Whitehall, while people were fighting their battles on 3 or 4 fronts, they visioned and created a new world order in the United Nations system, in the Bretton Woods, in the Marshall Plan, and in the welfare state. And yet we don't see anything like that at the moment. It feels more like we in First World War, where it's very antagonistic, where the superpowers seem to have rising tensions, and we might well see this followed by austerity and an even worse pandemic unless we fix the system. What do you make of that, and where do you think we are? How was it that these people in the midst of the war, and I know you've studied Keynes and the welfare state and others, how was it that they were able to rise above the huge devastation that they were experiencing and the pressures to vision and create a better world?
Well, I think part of the issue was that in World War II, we had to learn the lessons of World War One. So everybody remembered what Keynes had written about the dangers of what would happen after World War One if we didn't do the right thing. Keynes was prescient, and now we have to take on board those lessons. So that's the first moment, or the first lesson that we need to take on board. Now, the problem right now is that in many countries, we have a whole set of nationalistic, nativist leaders. And there's a correlation here. Those countries like Brazil and the United States, where those leaders have most influential, have done the poorest. So, and the countries where solidarity has been emphasized, where expertise has been emphasized, where there's a trust in government, countries like New Zealand have basically squashed the disease. So I hope that emerging from this pandemic will be a lesson similar to what happened after World War II, that we said we need to learn the importance of science, expertise, trust, solidarity, and the dangers of divisiveness.
We're talking about the rising tensions and whether we're in the First or Second World War. How do you read the growing tensions with China at the moment? And do you think that that we could be at the beginning of a Cold War 2.0?
Yes, I do. And I think it has multiple sources. There obviously are issues of economic competition, national security. I think that the growth of, you might say, authoritarianism, the concerns about the Uyghurs, what's happened in Hong Kong is of great concern. And it's very difficult, I think, for those who believe in democracy to just look the other way when confronted with what's happening with the Uyghurs in Hong Kong. So I do think we face a moment of challenge. It's different, though, than the old Cold War, because we now recognize that we have certain issues that we have to deal with globally, climate change and global health. So the challenge is, how are we going to be able to cooperate with countries with an economic and political system that we may not approve of or strongly disapprove of? But we will fight for our principles, but still say we have to learn how to cooperate. So it's a little bit analogy is if you're on the Titanic and the Titanic is going down and you're in a rowboat, there may be some people in that rowboat that you don't agree with, but you still want to row to shore.
Yeah. And there's no stopping climate change, and there's no stopping this or other pandemics or any of the other great threats we face without cooperating with China.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you think that if Biden were to win the presidency in the US in November, it would change this dynamic, or is there bipartisan shared feelings about China, do you think?
Well, I think there are bipartisan shared feelings. I think the difference is that there's a kind of nativism, simplistic protectionism underlying Trump's economic policies. So the problem is that he's confounded principle with primitivism. so while he's attacking sometimes China for the bilateral trade deficit, most economists say what matters is multilateral trade deficits. the issues are broader, deeper. He's focused on issues that are not issues. So by confusing the whole discussion, he makes it more difficult for us to get down to business on the things that are really important.
So the tensions would remain under a Biden presidency, but they would be articulated in trying to join problem solving on some issues.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
and highlight, I mean, for instance, Trump is reported to say it's okay with what you do with the Uyghurs.
Yeah.
I think you're going to get stronger positions from the Democrats on these issues of human rights and democracy.
Yeah. In the BBC series, The Pandemic That Changed the World, that actually the second episode is being broadcast today on the World Service, you say that this pandemic is not an equal opportunity pandemic, and you point to the fact that it's likely to raise inequality within countries and between countries. Could you say a bit about why you think so strongly that that's what's happening?
Well, within countries, you can see what's one of the consequences of it's not just that the pandemic has hit those who are poor and those in poor health, and those who are poor are more likely to be in poor health in all countries, but especially in a country like the United States, where we don't recognize the right to access to healthcare as a basic human right. But in a way, the pandemic is like a tax on people who come into close contact with each other in jobs. Those who can continue their business on Zoom, a better platform evidently than Crowdcast, those who can continue business on that have been relatively unaffected. So it's it changed the economic prospects of different parts of our population and been particularly harsh on, say, unskilled labor. Let me give you another way of seeing this is that robots don't come down with the virus. So this changes the relative cost of robots versus human beings for doing unskilled labor. So when you have an event like that changes technologies, the relative demand of skilled labor, unskilled labor versus machines, it tilts the demand for labor relative to that of machines, and that will depress wages. Now, across the developed versus developing countries, the same forces are at play, except in somewhat worse form, because the poorer countries have poorer health, have less economic resources. No poor country could have mounted the kind of $3 trillion program that the United States did, let alone the monetary injections that are estimated to be another $3 trillion. So they begin, in a sense, more vulnerable to the virus, and their economy is more vulnerable to the economic effects of the virus. And so it will increase, or at least threatens to increase, the disparity. Now, the advanced countries could come to their assistance, and the G20 made a commitment to do that. They said we'll use every instrument at our disposal. But then the U.S. government vetoed the use of the most important instrument, which is the issuance of $500 billion of SDRs. So that was one of the few instruments we had of giving large assistance, and we've not been forthcoming. The private sector has been even worse because a lot of countries undertook excessive debt in the years before the pandemic. Understandable, given that we were in a world with very low interest rates. Many of us warned against that, but then the pandemic occurred, and that that means many countries will have to restructure their debt. And some of the private sector creditors who claim to be socially responsible have shown themselves to be heartless and so short-sighted, just like they did in 2008. And so they said, we demand you pay more than the IMF says is sustainable. And so I worry about the kinds of debt turmoil that we may have going forward.
Yeah, I see the UN has called for at least $2.5 trillion, and so far we've got less than 100 billion. So sort of 5% of what's needed has been brought to the table. And when you contrast this with the response to the 2008 financial crisis, where there was global leadership, there was a global mobilization, how do you explain the fact that there's been such a tepid response now and such a very rapid and strong response to the crisis? Is it because finance speaks louder? Is it because we're asking for money for developing countries now and it was rich countries then? Is there capture of the lobbies, or is it because we have different people in the White House and in Whitehall and elsewhere? Why is the response been so bad this time?
I think I think leadership makes a very big difference. And I mentioned before that there is this kind of nativism, primitivism going around in many countries. You had Gordon Brown in the UK. You had better leadership in a large number of countries, and we see the absence of that leadership and almost a hostility to what is needed on the part of the United States. So I think you can't underestimate the importance of that. I do think that the market, the global financial market, realized that the world is interconnected, and so they made it part of a high part of their agenda to go forward and to have a global response. What particularly worries me at this moment is that there is the vaccine nativism. There was a call by Costa Rica at the WHO that all the intellectual knowledge be put at the disposal to all the countries, some prioritization of who gets the vaccines or wherever they're developed, who gets the therapeutics. That's really important. But the kind of nativism that we've seen meant that countries like the United States said, we want to protect our citizens first, betting, of course, that they would get the vaccine the first. No view about what happens if other countries act in exactly the same way. And you saw that very early in the pandemic when the United States said it wasn't going to allow the export of the N95 masks. They hadn't realized is that the U.S. imports far more than they do exports of medical supplies, and that if everybody reciprocated, we would be in a very bad shape. So this kind of introspection, recognizing what if everybody does the same thing, where would we be? You might say the simple golden rule. And maybe we ought to just be calling for that revival of remembering of the golden rule. And that would actually steer us towards a kind of global cooperation that is, if anything, more important in this crisis than it was in 2008.
Yeah, I found it one of the most disturbing things about the crisis, that you'd think it was the illustration of that we need solidarity, we need cooperation in order to resolve it, and instead we're seeing these extreme individualist by country and by individuals' responses. And in fact, aid might go down because the aid, which is calibrated as a share of GNI, 0.7 even in the UK, as our economy contracts in the UK, it'll be down at least 10% this year. The aid budget will contract with it. So not only will we not see a stronger response, we could see a weaker response in terms of solidarity, which disturbs me. You mentioned the robots and automation, and indeed you were due to be in Oxford in May, and we were going to work together. I know it's a shared interest we have on the future of work and technological change. Do you see this pandemic as accelerating automation and robotics, and do you think we're likely to see more dislocation in labor markets as a result of this?
Yes, I do. As I said before, the machines have problems, as we've just seen. Technologies do have problems, but and they have viruses. So I don't want to minimize it, but there is a difference. We managed so far to control the robot viruses much better than we've been able to manage COVID-19. So I think this will expose more the risk of human vulnerabilities, and that will in turn encourage people to go towards, you might say, non-human robots. And coming at a moment, as you mentioned, where AI has succeeded in getting machines that are not only stronger than humans, process information, but actually learn in limited domains, but faster than humans.
What are the implications of this for development? If the middle rungs of the development ladder are going to be increasingly removed as repetitive, automated tasks, which can be automated, whether it's in manufacturing or in call centers or in back offices of administrations, is there a real risk that the development model we've always understood, which is people will do these semi-skilled jobs, might simply disappear? And if so, where will the 10 million people a year coming onto the labor market in Africa get their future jobs from?
Well, I worry about that a great deal. The development model, which has been the most successful development model ever, and so much more successful than anybody had contemplated was possible, was the manufacturing export-led model. That's not going to be the basis of development in the coming decades. Simple reason is that globally, employment in manufacturing is declining. And that means that manufacturing won't be creating the jobs for the millions of people coming on to the labor market every year in developing country and emerging markets. So they have to devise an alternative strategy. Now I've tried to analyze why was manufacturing export-led growth so successful. It combined together learning, closing the knowledge gap between developed and less developed countries, provided employment, provided foreign exchange, did a lot of things, all in one package. And so I think the answer is to realize that going forward, the developing countries will have to get all those things, but in a portfolio, in a multi-pronged strategy that will involve agriculture, industry, service sector, some of the extractives, but they will have to be much cleverer in designing a strategy that leads them to an increase in their standard of living to development. So it's going to be more complex, and some of the countries will succeed, but I think it's going to be much more difficult for many of the countries.
Very tough, and we look forward to reading your work on this. You've also been very focused on the power of the big digital firms And what we've seen with COVID-19 is a further enhancement of the power of digital and pharmaceutical firms. Do you think that regulation of that sector is necessary? And what sort of things have you got in mind?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential. I think that one aspect is market power. They have a kind of market power that we have not seen before. It's different than the market power exercised at the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th in steel or oil. In some ways, it's much stronger because they have a disproportionate power in data. And data is, as some people say, is the new natural resource. And it has returns to scale. They can use that data to exploit individuals, to exploit their market power, to expand and make more durable their market power. So we've seen actually how they have amplified and abused their market power. And Europe has done a much better job in trying to limit that than the United States. Understandable because of the political influence that they have in the United States. But in the case of the digital companies, there are at least two other things that I think are of concern. Privacy and information and misinformation. One of the things that's been a very big disappointment on the part of Facebook is that its refusal to take down misinformation. And they were protected against liability in what we call Section 230. They couldn't be sued. Newspapers could be sued if they disseminated misinformation, but they were protected from what was called intermediate liability. And that has given them the power to do things that have been so harmful to our society. Hate speech, incitement, a whole variety of exacerbating societal ills. And this is a sort of one dimension. Another dimension that just came out in the last couple of days is the digital companies have also not been paying their fair share in taxes. They've been as clever in tax avoidance as they've been in their innovations. And of course, with more and more of commerce going digital, if the digital are not making their contributions, their fair share of taxes, then we don't have the resources for all the public goods that we need for education, for infrastructure, for investments in technology, like the creation of the internet, which was a result of public investment, for dealing with the pandemic, for public health. So the figuring out what to do about the digital giants, I believe, is at the core of what will have to be the challenges of the next decade.
Finally, Joan, and then because we've got a lot of questions, and I want to give a few minutes to the people that have posed them. You've been equally passionate about the urgency of the climate agenda. Do you, and I've seen, and I recommend to the participants the paper you've done with Nick Stern and Cameron Hepburn and others. Do you see this massive increase in public expenditure, which is going to be necessary to begin to restore economies after COVID-19, as an opportunity to accelerate progress on getting off fossil fuels, or do you worry that it's going to be that agenda is going to be slowed by what we're seeing at the moment and all the distraction of the health emergency, but also the restoration of economic activity?
Well, at least I hope that we can get those two agendas to work together. Never has government spent as much money as it has in responding to the pandemic. And it's making life and death decisions over enterprises. It should be using this opportunity to shape our economy to the economy that we want of the future. And that means a greener economy, a more knowledge economy, an economy with greater equality. Uh, we should be making sure that our money does double duty, that it helps us recover from the pandemic, improves our health, and helps create this kind of economy. Now, the point of the paper that you referred to was to say that there's not a trade off, that spending money to create a green economy can be done in a way that's has the timeliness and the flexibility that we need, and that's important because we want as quick as recovery as we can get, and we don't know how soon we'll be able to put the pandemic under control. That it can be very labor intensive, and that's very important because the job loss has been really beyond belief. And we want to increase demand for labor to try to create more equality that would drive up wages and address some of the massive inequalities that have been exposed so strongly by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that it has high multipliers. That means you get a lot of bang for the buck. That is going to be particularly important because the large deficits are going to make people wary about how much can we spend. So that means every pound you spend, or dollar or euro, has to be very effective. And the point that we try to say is that you can have green spending that meets all of these criteria.
And I think the European Commission certainly seems to have embraced that with their $2.5 trillion investment for shovel-ready projects, very much in line with what you've recommended. One of the reasons we do use Crowdcast, despite its terrible glitches, is that it allows people to pose questions and to vote on the questions. So the question with the most votes, there are 35 questions. The question with the most votes, 16, is do we have an integrated vision for dealing with the three crises, the health, economy, and ecology crises that we're facing now? And I think you just answered that question in large respect. So,
can I just add one point to that? Where in the United States, we've had this false debate whether we should be putting priority on the economy or on health. And the president said that the shutdown could be worse than dealing with the pandemic. Well, we now have a lot of data. And what we've seen is that not dealing with the pandemic is disastrous for the economy. The first priority has to be health. And the example in the United States that I think illustrates that most forcefully is that when the United States pandemic began, we recognized that we didn't want people who were sick going to work and spreading the disease. But in the United States, we don't have mandatory paid sick leave. Congress recognized that that was really, really dangerous in a country where a very large fraction of the population lives paycheck to paycheck, has under $500 in their bank account. So they passed a law that said that there had to be, there was mandatory paid sick leave, but only for COVID-19. We weren't going to be so generous to extend it beyond that. But then, under the influence of our richest and most powerful companies, we exempted all workers in companies with under 500 employees. In other words, roughly half our workforce. And people went to work and the disease spread. So that's an example of behavior that was unconscionable, immoral, I think, but also short-sighted. And we would have a stronger economic recovery if we would put health first.
I absolutely agree with you. The question that has the next most number of votes is, what are your views on universal basic income? You go first, Joe, and I'll add to the extent we're not aligned.
So this crisis, we've actually had a form of universal basic income. Everybody in the United States whose income was below a certain threshold, pretty high, got a $1,200 check. But it was a temporary palliative. It was not viewed as a permanent part of our economic architecture or welfare system. And I think that's correct. I think we're going to still need more because the pandemic was originally thought to be short term. Many people thought it would be a V-shaped recovery. We just put the economy in the hospital for a few weeks and we recover, we bounce back. Clearly a fantasy. But over the long run, what I see is there's dignity to work. There are an enormous number of jobs that need to be done. A lot of investment that's going to be needed for the green transition. We need infrastructure, we need education, we need caring for the aged, and we have lots of people who want to work. So what I say is the first priority is for government to make sure that everybody who is able and willing to work be matched with the work that needs to be done. And we failed. After World War II, we made a commitment to make sure that we would have full employment, and we basically have failed. Even in the best of times, we did not get full employment to minorities, to various groups within our society, disadvantaged. So we have to make that commitment now. And that should be our first priority.
Happily,
we also need to say that those wages that they get paid have to be livable wages. Yeah. It is, I think, again, unconscionable that people are working full time and are still in deep poverty.
Happily, I absolutely agree with you. Let me just add maybe two people get it too, and I think that's ethically wrong. I think we've lost Joe. Hopefully he'll come back straight in. And secondly, you in? Okay, just the image seems to have gone. Okay, I'm out, but you can hear me, can you? Obviously, Crowdcast didn't like the nasty things we said about it. And secondly, I think what we need to worry about is the arithmetic. It's impossible to pay everyone in a very high unemployment situation, even in rich countries, a living wage. And that's why we need to strive in all countries for decent employment for everyone and a safety net of basic income. I think we're beginning to run out of time, so I'm going to, unfortunately, have to end this. I really want to thank all the participants for your patience. It's been a very glitchy session, but hopefully you've got enough of Joe's incredible wisdom to have made it worthwhile for you. Joe, you've been fantastically patient with the technology. They all have their things, that this proves that we really do need to get you to Oxford and to have events in person as well. Your latest, your second latest book, because your latest book's on the future of Europe. Your second latest book, and I see many, many Europeans that have joined into this. Your second latest book from 2019 is on measuring GDP, and you also co-chair the OECD committee, which is looking into the future of measurement of GDP. And I just want to stress, really drawing on that, is that you're doing this not for any pecuniary gain. This is not going to show up in GDP this session, but certainly I believe that it's enriched us all, and you've been tremendously patient with your time. So thanks so much, Joe. For those of you that feel frustrated, do listen to The Pandemic That Changed the World on the World Service, and have a look at Joe's papers and his website. There's a huge amount there. Joe was also quite instrumental in the creation of the Oxford Martin School and encouraged its formation with the late Jim Martin. So Joe, the Oxford Martin School owes you a huge debt, and I do too. I wouldn't be where I am without you. So thanks to all of that. For those of you that are interested, there's an event tomorrow at the Oxford Martin School with Paul Collier and others, and that's going to be chaired by Cameron Hepburn. And further details are in the green button. You can register at that on this website. Another advantage of this website over Zoom. And we hope to see you engaged in the future. And Joe, to you, thank you so much for your time. It's enormously precious, and I've certainly found this extremely worthwhile, and I hope all the participants did too. Thanks to all of you, and Joe, thanks so much to you particularly.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.